I would like to draw your attention to the 4th chapter of the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1. Now it came about that when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became furious and very angry and mocked the Jews. He spoke in the presence of his brothers and the wealthy men of Samaria and said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Are they going to restore it for themselves? Can they offer sacrifices? Can they finish in a day? Can they revive the stones from the dusty rubble, even the burned ones?" Now Tobiah the Ammonite was near him, and he said, "Even what they are building, if a fox should jump on it, he would break their stone wall down. Hear, O our God, how we are despised. Return their reproach on their own heads and give them up for plunder in a land of captivity. Do not forgive their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out before you, for they have demoralized the builders." So we built the wall, and the whole wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Now it came about when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repair of the walls of Jerusalem went on and that the breaches were being closed, they were very angry. All of them conspired together to come and fight against Jerusalem and cause a disturbance in it. But we prayed to our God, and because of them we set up a guard against them day and night. Thus in Judah it was said, "The strength of the burden bearers is failing, yet there is much rubbish, and we ourselves are unable to build the wall." Our enemies said, "They will not know or see when we come among them and kill them and put a stop to the work." And it came about when the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times, "They will come up against us from every place where you may turn." Then I stationed men in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, the exposed places, and I stationed the people in families with their swords and spears and bows. And when I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses." Well, there are some standout phrases to me in this chapter. 3 times it says, "And it came about when." So here's the timing of providence. It said, "So we built." Well, the work goes on. And "but we prayed." That's in the face of opposition. And "remember the Lord." That's the basis for confidence. Those are standout phrases here. "But we prayed." Remember the Lord. Well, for Nehemiah and the people of Jerusalem, troubles began in earnest once the work started. You know, the devil's not afraid of good intentions, but when you begin to act on them, expect trouble. We have here before us continued, persistent opposition to the good work. You know, in some ways, if there was no opposition and the wall went up and the people whistled while they worked and the sun was shining and the birds were singing and the wall of Jerusalem goes right on up If that happened, and that was Nehemiah's account right here, I don't know about you, but I would tend to be kind of discouraged because what would we say? That's not my experience. When we start to do something for God, there is plenty of opposition. In fact, Raymond Brown, one of the men that I read, he says, battles in the area of sustained hostility. That's what we experience in the world. If you're a child of God and if you're intent on doing the work of God. So I've divided this sermon up under 4 headings. The rage of the enemy is the first one. Secondly, the prayer of the upright. Thirdly, the discouragement of the laborers. And then lastly, the encouragement of the leader. So we start with the rage of the enemy. There's inevitable conflict. Anytime God sets about to do something in the world, we can expect that. Well, these enemies here that are listed, at first they were just displeased. We found that earlier on in our reading when Nehemiah first arrived. He had the welfare of Jerusalem in mind. They were very displeased, we read. But now they're furious and angry and enraged. Those are the words used in different versions. And so it leads me to bring some things to light here in regard to anger, because anger appears in this portion twice. So far as I know, I've never spoken at all on anger. And so I want to just at least speak on anger under this heading right here at the beginning, the rage of the enemy. You know, anger is a very human emotion. In fact, 356 times in the Bible, some form of the word of anger is mentioned. That's a lot of volume. It's a very powerful emotion. It's gripping. The words in the Bible, fierce anger, come to mind. Oftentimes, it's suddenly triggered, prompting actions that are unbecoming and uncharacteristic, and after it's done, we're abhorred that we even stooped to that low. I might be describing your experience. I'm describing mine, not that recent past. We have these words, provoked to anger. Suddenly, there's a trigger. Provoked. Ask the question, who provokes it? We have heat involved in all of it. His anger burned, the Bible says. His anger was kindled. There's heat there. Even Moses, the most humble man on earth, became angry on several occasions. In fact, it was his vexed spirit that caused him to say, "Shall I bring water out of this rock for you rebels?" And he struck the rock twice, and God banned him from Canaan because of his anger. And he was the most humble man. Anger in the Bible affects many people in high places. King Saul, before he was a bad king, started out as a good king, and we're told that the Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily when he heard these words, and he became very angry. That is, the threats of Jabesh, the king of the Ammonites, who was going to put out every right eye of all of the men of Jabesh. The Spirit of the Lord came on Saul, and he got angry about that. So here at least is a righteous anger. But that same king, King Saul, after he had fallen, we're told that the wicked spirit came on him, and Saul's anger burned against Jonathan, his son, and he hurled his spear at him to strike him down, his own son. So you see two versions of anger there, and both of them were heated. David as well. David became angry. You know who he became angry at? God. Because when Uzzah reached up to steady the ark as it tipped on the cart, God struck him dead on the spot for touching the ark. The Bible says David became angry because of the Lord's outburst against Uzzah. Elisha the prophet was angry with the king at the time. He said, "You should have struck the ground with those arrows 5 or 6 times. You would have wiped out your enemy. Here's a missed opportunity." Elisha was angry about it. Jonah was angry. Remember what Jonah was angry about? He was angry because God was merciful. I mean, what a thing. Who prompts anger like that? Well, in Ephesians 4 and verse 26, we're told to be angry and do not sin, and not to let the sun go down on our wrath, and do not give the enemy, that devil, an opportunity. Well, we know that Jesus was angry. He was angry with the disciples when they were shooing the kids away. The word says he was indignant and said to them, "Let the children come to me." And that time that he went to heal the man with the withered hand, again on the Sabbath, those Pharisees were sitting there all hard-hearted. It says Jesus looked around at them with anger, grieved at the hardness of their heart. And he went ahead and healed them right in front of them anyway. There's righteous anger there. But that's the anger of the Son of God. The anger of man is not like that. In Galatians 5 and verse 20, on that list of the works of the flesh, we have outbursts of anger. That's a really accurate description because it bursts out, doesn't it, when we're angry? James warns us in chapter 1 and verse 19 to be slow to become angry. And he says, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. So if human anger doesn't produce the righteousness of that God desires, who prompts that anger all the time? The one who despises the righteousness of God, the enemy of our souls. A fool's anger is known at once. An angry man stirs up strife. A hot-tempered man abounds in transgression. Those are all in Proverbs. And anger is not to be a characteristic, a trait of your pastor. Not quick-tempered. That applies just as much as not being addicted to wine and not being a brawler. You don't want a guy who's your pastor that's getting in fist fights around town and tipping the bottle and has a short fuse. You see? Anger is an emotion of God. It's mentioned many, many times in the Bible. Always against sin and against sinners, and obstinance and hardness of heart and things like that. But I'm thankful in several places the Lord is slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness. He puts up with so much from me. How many times I could have angered him and frustrated him to the extent that he said, "I'm done with you," and wipe me off the earth. But he's slow to anger. He puts up with so much. Micah tells us when he does get angry, he does not retain his anger forever because he delights in unchanging love. He's not looking to get angry and punish me. He's looking to love me. Well, I say all of that to say Satan and his agents are very angry. Now, Sanballat and Tobiah are agents. They're operating that way as agents of the devil. And they're always angry. The devil's always prompting them and pushing them in the area of anger. Think of it, in the first family that existed, Cain killed Abel because he was angry. Abel offered a blood sacrifice. Cain brought the best of his fruit. God accepted the blood sacrifice, a type of Christ. So what happened? The devil hates that. He uses that anger, prompts that anger, and the next thing you know, out of the first two brothers in the first family on earth, one murders the other one. The devil does that. Sanballat is one of the agents of the devil, and he represents the enemy who's bent on stopping this work of God, which is building the wall around Jerusalem. So Sanballat, naturally, he becomes very angry, furious, and full of rage. The devil does that. Well, you know, Agent Sanballat and Agent Tobiah are still alive in this world. Everywhere you go, there's a Sanballat, there's a Tobiah, an agent of the devil, sent to disrupt the work. And their angry efforts are still in the same way aimed at discouragement and demoralization and destruction of faith. That's what he's got in mind, not just to make things difficult. And what strategy does he use? He uses the age-old one right here in this chapter. Personal attacks. He says, these feeble Jews, he calls them, how pitiful and helpless and weak you are. You ever have the devil tell you that? You ever hear that voice? You can't do that. You're too weak. That's pitiful. You don't have enough strength. What can you possibly do? That's Sanballat, or at least the spirit of Sanballat, the spirit behind Sanballat. These feeble Jews. Will they restore their wall? They don't have enough resolve. You don't have enough resolve to do what you're wanting to do for God. What you set out to do for God, you're never going to accomplish it. That's what he's saying right here, basically. Will they offer sacrifices, he asks. Well, what does that mean? He's saying there's not going to be a completion ceremony, complete with sacrifices. You'll never make it. Instead, there's a big disappointment looming ahead for you in this pitiful attempt. Can they finish in a day? You think you're going to breeze right through this? You think it's smooth sailing, a piece of cake, no problems? You think it's going to be that? You'll never last. You will never last. That's what he's telling them. Will they revive the stones and even the usable ones burned as they are? He's saying there and highlighting how insurmountable the task is for you. Haven't you noticed? This is too big of a job for you, you feeble Jews. You don't have what it takes. You see, these things that are coming out of the mouth of Sanballat are the very things the devil says to me and says to you. It's phrased a little bit different, but it's the same thing. You can't do that. You're too weak. And then Tobiah chimes in and he says if a fox would jump on it, he'd break their stone wall down. In other words, what you have done so far, the whole thing is fragile and insignificant, and it won't matter, and it'll never last. The fox is going to come along and jump on that thing, and it'll fall down. And it was a big thing to laugh at. Well, it was not the first time. In Ezra, the days of the building of the temple, and under Zerubbabel, the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build, and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purposes. So you see these agents of the devil are everywhere. Sanballat and Tobiah are a couple of the standouts, but there are many more in the way of enemies of God contained in the biblical record. There's Pharaoh, there's Goliath, there's Haman, there's Herod, there's Judas Iscariot. That's just 5 of them, right? As I was thinking off the top of my head. And they all start the same way, with mockery. Look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they've hidden themselves. Come on up here and we'll show you a thing. That's what they said to Jonathan in the days of Saul. The Pharisees did. I mean, not the Pharisees, the Philistines. How about Goliath? We heard about him just a few weeks ago. When he saw David, he disdained him. Why? Because he was a pretty boy. He was handsome, young, ruddy is the word used. I don't know whatever that means. But he was a pretty boy. And who was Goliath but the champion, the best the Philistines had to offer? And he disdained him, and he said, am I a dog that you come out here with sticks? And he cursed David by his gods. Come to me and I'll feed your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. So that is the verbal attacks of Tobiah and of Sanballat. Now we see, having looked at the rage of the enemy, now we see the prayer of the upright. Nehemiah's reaction to this ridicule. And Nehemiah was a man of prayer. He did what he should have done, which was pray, and he did what came natural to him, which was pray. To him, the God of heaven is not just a source of success, but he's a very present help in time of trouble. And this is an honest prayer. He says we are despised, and the world despises the church, the true church anyway. It might embrace false religion at every turn. That's okay. But if it's the true church, it's going to be despised by the world. Nehemiah says, we are despised. And then he prays this prayer. Now, how are we to understand Nehemiah praying like this? It brings me to another topic that I've never preached on at all as far as I know, and that is imprecatory prayer, or the imprecatory psalms. Psalms are prayers where curses are called down on your enemies. Well, how do we understand Nehemiah praying like this? He says, return their reproach on their own heads, give them up for plunder in a land of captivity. Do not forgive their iniquity. Do not let their sin be blotted out before you. That's hard stuff. Well, Sam Storms had this to say about imprecatory prayers, and I'll share it with you. It's insightful. He said, some believe these imprecatory prayers are the expressions of man's sinful desire for vengeance on his enemies. These psalms, so some have said, are not God's precepts, but man's defective prayers. They are cold-blooded expressions of malignant cruelty and must never be regarded as inspired of God. Well, that's what some people say. But that's not what they are. Storms goes on to say they are calculated petitions, not spontaneous explosions of a bad temper. These prayers are not expressions of personal vengeance. David's passion was for the triumph of divine justice, not the satisfaction of personal malice. The motivation behind such prayers is zeal for God's righteousness, God's honor, God's reputation, and the triumph of God's kingdom. So here we have Sanballat and Tobiah, and they've not only reviled God's servants who are attempting to do God's work, they've abused God's name. That's how it's perceived. The psalmist David said, return in Psalm 79:12, return sevenfold into the lap of our neighbors the taunts which they have taunted you, O Lord. Well, it might help us in terms of imprecatory prayer to consider these prayers or these psalms in terms of history and recognize that we are on this side of the cross. We've got a gospel to impart now. Nevertheless, Jesus said, the one who listens to you listens to me, and the one who rejects you rejects me, and the one who rejects me rejects God. You see how it goes all the way up? So when I'm here preaching the gospel and it's rejected, you're not just rejecting me. You're rejecting Christ and you're rejecting God. That's rejection of the gospel. Well, it's the same way with the taunts of the enemy or their insults or whatever else. They're not just insulting the Christian who's trying to present the gospel to them. They're insulting the Christ of that Christian and the God of that Christ. It goes right on up the chain, you see. But nevertheless, I don't sit down and pray, Lord, do not forgive their iniquity. Do not let their sin be blotted out before you. That's not my prayer. So what's the difference? Well, in history, all of history culminates at the cross, the sacrifice of Christ. And we're on this side of the cross now. So what we have is Jesus saying, you have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That's not an imprecatory prayer. And you have the Apostle Paul in Romans 19 saying, if your enemy's hungry, give him something to eat and feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. Paul, in his second letter to Timothy, gave him a warning about a person called Alexander the coppersmith. He said, he did me much harm, and he warned Timothy against him. But he didn't turn around and pray that God would never blot out his sins or his transgressions or his iniquities. What did he say? He said, the Lord will repay him according to his deeds. So using imprecatory prayers from the Psalms today should only be done against our spiritual enemies. You see, behind every attack that comes my way is a spiritual enemy. That is where the application comes for imprecatory prayers nowadays. Praying that our human foes would die or that bad things would happen to them or their families is unjustifiable in the day of the gospel and grace. For David, for Nehemiah, they saw the underlying evil as being diabolical. And it helps us to remember this. All of God's plan throughout history is to be considered in the light of the coming of Christ, in who was the redemption of mankind. All throughout history, God was doing that. All the way up until the coming of Jesus and the death, the burial, the resurrection, the ascension. All of that was in the history, in the plan, in the making of God. So whenever Satan opposed that in the day of David or in the day of Nehemiah, he was opposing the plan of redemption. He wanted to stop the Messiah. And you remember that God spoke of Christ all the way back in the garden. The seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. The serpent's head will be crushed by the offspring of the woman. So Satan simply didn't have in mind to cause mischief and sorrow and wreak havoc in the world or in Jerusalem during the day of the construction of the wall. He wanted to destroy the possibility of the sacrifice and coming redemption. All along, he's opposing because of that. You remember in Revelation 12, the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who's to rule the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. That's Christ. But here you have this dragon, and he's right there waiting to put an end to all of that, devour the child. So what happened? The very next verse, the dragon was enraged with the woman. And he went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. That's you and me. Here is this prayer of David in Psalm 139. They speak against you wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with the utmost hatred. They've become my enemies. That's a chilling prayer. It's like, wow, David. But that's not one that you and I should adopt for the guy on the job who makes fun of us. We should use that against our spiritual enemies. So you see, we've got to be more discerning there. We've got to see this guy he's just manipulated by the devil. He's a dupe of Satan. He's an agent. Set to oppose, do battle with the children of the woman. So that's how we're to understand imprecatory prayer. In light of history, in light of the redemptive plan of God and every opposition trying to thwart that. That's the enemy, the unseen enemy, doing that. Well, those were a couple rabbits I chased. Verse 6, so we built the wall. I like this guy. So in face of all of that, the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. In the face of opposition, the sound of taunts and jeers, in the hot, heavy labor, in the unity of common conviction, the wall was joined together to half its height. The people had a mind to work. Are there any of us today engaged in the Lord's service whose heart is not in it? I've been there before. You know, sometimes it's an up and down thing. Man, my heart is just not in the study today. It's not in it. That happens to us. But here their heart was in it. It says mind, but the original is literally heart. They had a heart to work. They put their heart to it. And the wisdom of Nehemiah here, connect the wall in some way, eliminate all of the breaches up to halfway. That's better than finishing this section over by the fish gate, finishing this one over here by the fountain gate, and all of the holes are left in between. Get it halfway up, all the way around. That was wise for him. Well, that was the prayer of the upright. So we've seen the rage of the enemy, the prayer of the upright. Here's the discouragement of the laborers. And it's understandable, honestly. Verse 5, they're discouraged with the mockery. They have demoralized the builders, Nehemiah said. So here they are, demoralized, discouraged, desperate. Well, that makes me conclude, you know, it's bad to listen to the voice of the enemy. You start listening to him. You start believing what he has to say. Oh, you're weak. pitiful. You'll never make it. You won't survive. It's all fragile. You might as well give up. You start listening to that. Don't listen to it. Take up the shield of faith. What does the shield of faith do? It quenches the fiery darts. Those flaming arrows shot out. Boom. Shield of faith. The hand of God has been favorable to me. The God of heaven will give us success, and we, his servants, will arise and build. That's the voice of faith. Well, here's a conspiracy. They were discouraged with the mockery. Now they were discouraged by this conspiracy. We've got it in verse 7. Now it came about when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard the repair of the walls of Jerusalem went on, and that the breaches began to be closed. They were very angry, and all of them conspired together to come and fight against Jerusalem and cause a disturbance. Here's a conspiracy. I mentioned before Sanballat, he's head over the Samaritans in the north. Tobiah, he's head over the Ammonites in the east. Geshem, he's head of the Arabs in the south. And now we have listed Ashdodites. Who are the Ashdodites? Well, they're from Ashdod, which was a capital city, one of the cities of the lords of the Philistines, which is on the west, toward the Mediterranean. So if you caught all of that as I ran through it quickly, Jerusalem is surrounded with enemies on all sides, and they conspired together. David said in Psalm 83, they make shrewd plans against your people and conspire together against your treasured ones, for they have conspired together with one mind against you. And they make a covenant. You remember in the days of the Lord Jesus, Herod and Pilate became friends with one another. Whereas it says they were enemies, they became friends with one another when it came to persecuting Christ. Conspiring, conspiracy. The devil does that too. He can bring together men who are in high places that were enemies to join forces against the cause of Christ. Well, when mockery fails, violence follows. Verse 8, they're going to fight Jerusalem. Cause a disturbance in it. The NIV says, their strategy, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to the work. A surprise attack. You think this is just Sanballat and Tobiah and they're just kind of upset about things, and this is the devil doing that. So the discouragement of the laborers, it's understandable. There's mockery. There's conspiracy against them and threats of violence, and there's also exhaustion. It contributes to discouragement. They had made the wall join together to half its height at this point in time. Now, Kathleen Kenyon, a British archaeologist who has given us much information on the excavation of ancient Jerusalem, says that the wall of Nehemiah was 9 feet thick. Now that's substantial. That's not a cinder block wall. You see, that's 9 feet thick. So even to half of its height, and some they say was 3 meters tall, so that's plenty tall when it was all finished. That's a lot of work. Has happened already. Well, in verse 10, we have what the common opinion was, the people in Judah. The strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. That word failing right there, it means falter, totter, stumble. You can picture a burden bearer, somebody with a big boulder on his shoulder, trying to make it over there for the next course of block. The strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. Failing strength, exhaustion, it contributes to discouragement. and despair. Then the overwhelming nature of the work contributes to discouragement. There is too much rubble. By ourselves, we're not able to build the wall. Overwhelming difficulty meets human inability. You ever get overwhelmed by things? I know as a pastor or a preacher, you begin to look 5 years, 10 years down the road. Man, this last sermon, it was a real struggle trying to get that. And I got to do this for 10 more years? Longevity, long term. How am I going to make it? How can I make it? Better men than me haven't been able to. The overwhelming nature of the work contributes to discouragement if we let it. So we have physical exhaustion coupled with nervous exhaustion. And it's decimating to our perspective and to perseverance. They said, it's too much for us. We're unable. We ourselves are unable to rebuild the wall. So pray. If you want something to pray about, pray for perseverance. For me, for yourselves, for others. Pray for perseverance in the work. A step forward is still a step, even if it doesn't have any spring in it. Forward direction. William Carey, I read this week, the missionary to India, said to his son as he was nearing the end of his life, he said, if they say I am a genius, that is not true. But if they say I can plod, that is true. I can plod. One foot in front of the other, one more step. It doesn't have to be springy. It's forward progress. So the overwhelming nature of the work contributes to their discouragement. Rampant fearfulness contributed to their discouragement. In verse 12, at that time the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us repeatedly, 10 times they said to us, you must return to us. Now, there are some differences of opinion what they were actually saying, what was actually happening right there. Brown says the Hebrews here in verse 12 what they said can be translated as a plea from the Judeans urging their husbands to return home. You remember last week I said there were those that came from various places, Mizpah and Tekoa and different places that some of them were 15 miles away almost. Well, those places were vulnerable too. They were allies. Jerusalem, the husbands there helping. It could be that that's what they were saying right here in verse 12, fear. The imminence of a violent conflict, it was ready to happen, and they were fearful. So this prevalent fear leads to discouragement. You know, in Deuteronomy 20 and verse 8, whenever Israel was getting ready to go to war, they had a rule. The officers shall speak further to the people and say, who is the man that is afraid and faint-hearted? Now, if you're a soldier, it'd be kind of hard to say, wouldn't it? But they wanted you to do that. If you were afraid and faint-hearted, let's hear it, he says. Let him depart and return to his house. You mean I can be exempt from this battle against the Philistines later today because I'm afraid? Yeah. Why is that? So that he might not make his brothers' hearts melt like his. Fearfulness, it's contagious. But it wasn't the time for fear, it was the time for faith. So the people prayed. We have in verse 9, we prayed to our God. And we set up a guard against them day and night. Prayer and vigilance, they go hand in hand. We prayed and we got ready to fight, basically is what that means. Here they were doing the right things. They were doing the work of God, being led by such a man as Nehemiah in the city of Zion, and they were exhausted and discouraged and fearful. All of those things happened even in the midst of doing the will of God, being in the will of God. And that's something for us to take away from this too. The fact that these things happen doesn't mean you're out of the will of God. It may mean that you should be encouraged in some ways. Well, Brown says it was natural for them to pray, for in prayer they were affirming their faith, sharing their anxieties, acknowledging their weaknesses, and confessing their need. They could help one another in corporate prayer. This is a corporate prayer. The first one was Nehemiah's private prayer. This is we prayed to our God. That's the church meeting, all church prayer, and putting our hearts together, lifting our voices together. Corporate prayer. And then lastly, we've got the encouragement of their leaders. So the rage of their enemies, the discouragement of the laborers, here's the encouragement of their leaders. He says in verse 14, "When I saw their fear, I arose, spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people." That pretty much takes in everybody. Those aristocrats and the official civil guys, the guys overseeing everything, and the people doing the work. So I addressed all of them. And what did he say? Do not be afraid of them. Well, why is that? What do you mean, Nehemiah? Don't be afraid of them. We're surrounded. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. And fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. Remember the Lord. Remember the Lord. Remember him how? Well, remember he created heaven and earth, didn't he? Spoke it into existence. Remember Noah? He spared Noah when he wiped everybody out. Noah and 8 others safe in the ark. That Lord, remember him. Remember Abraham? He gave him a son in his old age, just like he promised. Remember Joseph? Sold into slavery. God advances him second to Pharaoh. Remember Moses? Parts the Red Sea for him. And he leads a nation of 2 million people across it, they say. Remember the Lord. Remember him in the case of Pharaoh. He decimated Egypt with signs and wonders. Remember Joshua. Remember the Lord in the case of Joshua. They took nation after nation after nation and conquested all of Canaan. What about Elijah? Remember the Lord in the case of Elijah? He called down fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice on Mount Carmel when he waged war with the prophets of Baal, who were agents of the enemy. Remember David? We heard about David. He slew a giant, cut off his head with one stone, shot him in the head, killed him. Remember Hezekiah? The very king of Assyria decided to come and take Jerusalem. Hezekiah brought it before the Lord, laid it out before the Lord in prayer. And what did the Lord do? The Lord said he won't even fire an arrow. And the next day his whole army was wiped out. And he got up and went back home, and he was murdered by his 2 sons in the temple of his God. Remember that Lord. Remember the Lord of Hezekiah. Remember the Lord in the days of Ezra when the temple was being built in this very city of Jerusalem, all of the opposition, but yet it got put together. God did it. Remember the Lord. So will God now allow his enemies to prevail in the building of this wall? That's Nehemiah's argument. It's all faith in God, you see. Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord. Will he now allow his enemies to prevail over us? We'll get through this. The Lord will get us through this. And that's the same word we say here today for our church, for whatever we might face, whatever the future holds for us. Remember the Lord. The Lord will get us through this. Jesus said, have faith in God. Well, I finish with a quote from Oliver Cromwell in the Battle of Edgefield in 1642. He told his troops in that opening fight of their English Civil War, he said, put your trust in God, my boys, but mind to keep your powder dry. So trust in God, but be ready to fight. We prayed to our God, and because of them, we set up a guard against them day and night. Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight. Fight for your families and your houses. Well, that's what we get out of these first 14 verses of this chapter.